you all are doing well in what I think to be is week 4 of class. I get a little bit confused because that first week is kind of a warm-up time, but I do believe this is, as per the academic calendar, our 4th week into the semester. This week we'll be talking about sociological research. Last week we looked at theory, and now we're going to focus on kind of the other side of the equation, that is research. So as I was preparing for today's lecture, it dawned on me that this is really one of those topics where visual aids come in quite handy. And since I've not been able to master that technology of the audio over the PowerPoint, or we're having all types of technical difficulties, I'm going to, in addition to this video lecture, I'm also going to post a PowerPoint that has the notes that I am basing my lecture on, so that you have that at your disposal if you find that helpful. Okay, so first I wanted to give you a broad overview of the sociological research process. This is probably going to sound quite familiar, as it's not all that dissimilar to the research process associated with the more physical science disciplines. So researchers, we first start off with a general topic of interest, or maybe even a specific question we want answered. And then we begin the research process by thinking about theories that may inform this question or this topic of interest, and looking at previous literature, previous research that has been done on the subject under examination. After we review the theory and the literature, then we start to formulate hypotheses, or start to consider what we expect to find through our research. The difference between hypotheses and expectations depends on the type of analysis that you're doing, something I'll speak about in a few moments. After you think about what your hypotheses are, or figure out what those expectations might be, then you analyze your data, and then you think about the findings that you come to and the conclusions that they suggest, or the implications associated with those findings. Okay, so I want to take just a couple of minutes to look at each stage of that process a little bit more closely, starting with the review of the literature. So like I mentioned a moment ago, what this essentially is a search for prior research on a topic area. And why is this important? Well, it's important to learn more about the topic that you're wanting to study. In order to know what still needs to be addressed, you have to know what we've already figured out about it. That just makes intuitive sense, I think. It helps formulate a relevant research question. Now, hypotheses or expectations, it's essentially kind of what you think is going to come out of your data analysis. This often stems from what the previous literature has found, or what theories you're using to inform your research. And then after you formulate these hypotheses or consider the expectations, you start to do your actual analysis. Excuse me. There are 2 types of sociological analysis, quantitative and qualitative. I'm going to discuss quantitative analysis first, because I think this is what most of you are probably a little bit more familiar with. So quantitative research is modeled after the physical science disciplines. There's a big focus on measurements and numbers with quantitative analysis. So this type of research is more outcome oriented, in that it's looking to see what factors contribute to a specified outcome. So, for example, if you wanted to think about how to explain variations in income, you may want to think about how gender affects income earnings, race, class, education, your geographical area, urban versus rural, right? So all of those things might contribute to that outcome of income earnings. That is an example, a very basic example of quantitative research. On the other side of the spectrum, we have qualitative research, and qualitative research is much more interpretive. It focuses on processes rather than actual outcomes. So to give you an example of qualitative research, I think I mentioned, at least in the introduction forum and maybe even the introduction video that I did a few weeks ago, that my dissertation project is looking at the social construction of difference between immigrants and non-immigrant groups in newspaper articles. And so what I'm getting at here is the process of symbolic boundaries. How are those differences between us, the native-born, and them, the foreign-born, constructed? Right? That's a process, not necessarily an outcome that I'm looking at. So to back up very briefly to say a few more things about quantitative research, quantitative researchers center their analysis around variables. So I'm beginning to use terms that might be slightly repetitive for some of you, but just bear with me if that's the case. So a variable is essentially a topic of interest. It's anything that varies. So an example would be GPAs, for example, that vary significantly across students. Now, if I wanted to study GPAs among women in college, gender would not be a variable in that statement because I'm looking at GPAs of women, right? Women, that gender would be a constant. I could examine how study time, employment, family situation, residence, and many other things affect GPA among women, but the women itself, again, that's not a variable, that would be a constant. There are two types of variables. You have an independent variable and a dependent variable. Independent variables are thought to influence the dependent variable. The dependent variable is really what you're interested in explaining, and the independent variables are the factors that you think contribute to that outcome. To give you another example, I have an article under review right now where I look at Latinos' feelings of commonality towards blacks and whites. So that is those are my dependent variables. That's what I'm interested in explaining. And in the models that I use to try to explain that outcome, I included a whole slew of variables, but the one that was of interest, the independent variable of interest, was news viewership. And so that was essentially what I wanted to see. Does increased news viewership affect Latinos' feelings towards African Americans? And does news viewership affect Latinos' feelings towards whites? Okay, now on the PowerPoint that I'm going to upload, there are a few slides that give you some examples of independent variables and dependent variables, and it talks about directionality associated with hypotheses. So review those on your own. Make sure you understand those examples. I think that will help solidify a lot of what I've talked about here. Okay. So back to the process where we're at. We, again, start with kind of a general topic of interest or maybe even a specific research question. We look at the theory, we look at the literature. We consider our hypotheses or our expectations depending on the type of analysis we're going to conduct. Then we collect our data in order for us to be able to analyze it. Excuse me. That's incredibly awkward. I apologize. Okay, so what does the actual data look like that sociologists get their hands on? There are a wide array of types of data that we look at, and really that speaks to the overall subject that we study, that is human society. There are lots of, human society is very complicated and very complex, and as a result, the data that we have at our disposal to look at human society is also quite varied and complex. Probably the most common type of data would be that of survey research. This involves a series of questions asked of a number of people. I think that we all, at one time or another, probably have experience taking surveys. The U.S. Census is a really great example of a survey done on a very large scale. Researchers take a sample from a population. So let's say that a researcher wanted to examine an outcome associated with the U.S. population. You can't necessarily sample every single citizen unless you're the U.S. government because of time and monetary constraints. And so researchers take a representative sample and then they run all of these statistical models and analyses, and the results, if they're statistically significant, speak to what's going on in the larger population. Another type of sociological, I need to back up for just a second and mention that surveys are primarily used for quantitative type analysis. Okay, another type of research that sociologists engage in, not nearly as common as surveys, would be experimental designs. And so this is where you set up a setting, you solicit respondents or participants in your survey, you are looking for a specific outcome, and you manipulate an independent variable. So you really do have, researchers have a lot of control with this type of research. We'll be looking at an experimental design not too far from now. It's going to talk about Milgram's study on authority, and I think that that will really help you appreciate what experiments have to offer, and then also why they're not all that common within the discipline of sociology. Sorry about that. Okay, another type of research that sociologists engage in, or another type of data that we use, are interviews, where you ask individuals questions. Most of the time these are in-depth interviews, and this type of data lends itself more to qualitative analyses. And so interviewers can either go in with a set of questions or more general topics they want to cover. Interviews can be structured to unstructured to somewhere in between. And so they take what people say and then they analyze it. One of the most quintessential examples of a sociological project that uses interviews is Howard Becker's study of marijuana users. So he wanted to know how it is that people come to be regular marijuana users. He conducted this during the 1970s, and so the population that he thought would best answer this question was jazz musicians. So he conducted multiple interviews with many musicians, and he found that this process of becoming a regular marijuana smoker involved three components. So first, the person would have to learn the technique of smoking marijuana. Secondly, they had to learn to recognize the effects that they were experiencing as stemming from marijuana. And then lastly, they had to learn how to appreciate those effects, because some of the side effects of marijuana, extreme thirst, hunger, euphoria, those types of things, those aren't necessarily pleasurable until you begin to appreciate that is what they are intended to be. Okay, So there are also participant observations where the researcher directly observes the behavior of the individuals in their social environment. So researchers will go to a social setting and just observe how people interact, how people talk with one another. And this can be anything from conversations people have, how people eat, how people sit, things like that. There is a piece of research that used this method. It's a book called Fast Food, Fast Talk by Robin Leiter. And what she was looking at is authority and control in the fast food industry, how workers are controlled by management. And what she found, she actually gained employment at a McDonald's restaurant in order to examine this process, the mechanisms through which management controls its employees. She found out that a lot of what they do is highly routinized, even all the way down to how to mop a floor correctly, right? There is a policy, a procedure on how to mop a floor in a McDonald's, and that speaks to the routinization of that type of industry. So lastly, there are content analyses or frame analyses, and this is when a researcher analyzes documents and text for their context. So this can be a wide variety of things, from newspapers like I do, television programs, movies, historical documents, legal cases, Supreme Court rulings, right? Any type of visual or written textual data is open to sociological analysis. Okay, that is all that I have prepared by way of lecture. I hope that I've provided some clarity here. Make sure that you do the course readings that are outlined on the course schedule, which you can find in the first folder under the course materials tab in our classroom. And let me know if you have any questions or if I can provide further clarification. That's it for now. I will see you all next week. Bye. Oh.